Hello everybody, I'm Eric Valentine. We are going to do a deep dive into the features and design approach for the UTEQ500. If you want something quicker, I had done a sort of fast talking, minute-and-a-half long thing that just very quickly describes, basically what the features are and what I think is cool about it, So if you want something real quick, you can find that video on the Undertone Audio YouTube channel. Go and check that out. But here, we're going deep. I'm going to really dig into what all of these features are, what they do, be able to show you how they all work, what the design is on the EQ. Then we're going to get into listening to some stuff so I can actually demonstrate what I think is really cool about these EQs. So by the end of it, you'll really know what's going on with these things. So first, we're going to talk about all of the features. I'll be working with this EQ for demonstrating this part of it. There's 3 bands. All 3 bands, the controls are the same, except for the range of frequencies that you can select. There's a high frequency, there's a mid band that's switchable between high and low mid, and then there's a low band. Each one has a gain control, which is this lower knob here, a frequency control, which is the lower knob here, and then the upper knobs. And so the blue upper knob is the Q control, and the black upper knob is the shape control. And that's the really unique part of this equalizer. So here we go. Let's start looking at what these things do. Right now, when I have the shape control all the way counterclockwise, it'll just be a conventional peak shape. And so I'm going to start boosting here. Dun, 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 dun. And so there you go. You'll see a good amount of boost. The boost and cut range is 15 dB. So you can boost 15 dB or you can cut 15 dB. And that is all selected with this little toggle switch here. Right now I'm in boost mode, and then conversely, it will cut as much as 15 dB. So we'll stay in the boost mode so we can see what this thing is doing. First thing is the Q control. In the fully counterclockwise position, which is where it's at now, that is the widest Q or bandwidth. That'll get you a Q of about 0.3. And then as you start turning it clockwise, you'll see it just gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. In the fully clockwise position, it's a Q of about 10. It's really, pretty surgical when you get in there. I know there's plugins now that get really crazy narrow Qs, but not many hardware EQs do that. There was only a few out there that I had that would do that, and I really wanted this one to do it because it's super useful for certain things. So I'm going to widen this back out so I can show the shape control. So the shape control, again, fully counterclockwise, is just a conventional peak shape. And when I start turning this shape control clockwise, everything above the frequency that's selected starts to come up, and it starts to turn into a shelf shape. And when you get to about the halfway point, it should come up and basically stay up and just be a conventional shelf shape. So the boost will rise up to the frequency that you have selected and then stay up. And when you start going past the halfway point, then the place where the frequency is selected starts to come down. And then you can get these really interesting, more super linear rises in the slope of the shelf EQ. And if you keep going even further, then you get to one of these really great vintage style shelf shapes. I'm most familiar with it on the early 80 series Neve modules, so like a 1073, 1081, 1084, like any of those, that era of Neve stuff does this, where you get this undershoot before it comes up. And it's kind of an odd thing because the frequency that I have selected right now looks like it's around 400 hertz. But when you switch to this shelf mode, it sort of goes down first, then starts to go up at 400 hertz, and it really levels off as a shelf more up around 4K. And so it's a very different way to derive a shelf shape. And in those early EQs, It was the sound that they wanted for that shelf on that EQ, and so they called it a 10K EQ, but unquestionably the frequency that was selected was probably way below that. And but you know, where you get to when it actually levels off as a shelf is, you know, what they defined the EQ as on the faceplate. And the reason for this, and here I'll talk a little bit about the design of the EQ. An EQ is basically like a little miniature mixer. And so you have an incoming signal, it gets split into two paths. One of them just stays exactly like the original signal. The other one gets filtered. And so you can do like a bandpass filter or a high-pass filter, and when you blend that filtered signal back in with the signal that has been unchanged, which is essentially the original signal, then you get an EQ where you can start to boost a particular frequency range, you know. So if it's filtered as a band pass, then you will have a peak shape. If it's a high pass, then you will get a high frequency shelf. If it's filtered as a low pass, then you will get a low frequency shelf. And so the way the undertone EQs work is they're based on what's called a state variable filter. And so when that signal gets split in the little mini mixer, the one that gets filtered gets split into three components: a low pass, a band pass, and a high pass. And when you recombine those three things, it's basically totally flat again. And you can access each one of those three different filtered elements and combine them in different ways to create all these different shapes. And so that's what we're doing. And the shape control is basically just blending the band pass filter of the state variable filter and either the high pass part to create a high shelf or the low pass part to create a low shelf. That's really what this knob is doing. And so when I'm all the way clockwise, it is now only blending in the high-passed signal to create a high-frequency shelf. And as I turn this thing back counterclockwise, what happens is it starts blending in the band pass of the state variable filter. And then when you get to the halfway point, we set up the gain structure so that should be, you know, roughly, it comes up to the frequency you have selected and then stays up. And then when I go continue past that halfway point and continue to turn it down or counterclockwise, then you see that high pass filter getting removed, and then you're left with the band pass filter, and it's just a peak EQ at that point. So that's really how it works. And the state variable filter is really straightforward. It's just an RC network, just resistor capacitor network that creates these different filtered components and breaks up that signal into those three components: low pass, band pass, high pass. The cool thing about it is that you get all of these versions of a shelf. And that's really what's unique about it. Everybody that has gone through the process of designing an equalizer has had to choose at a certain point of like, what do I want my shelf to look like? Do I want it to look like this, the sort of classic Neve with this undershoot down here? Or do I want to have it just come up to the frequency and stay up? Or do I want something that's like more linear like this? And they all have a different sort of character to them. All of these will sound a little bit different. When I dug through a lot of the vintage EQs, there was a lot of different, you know, approaches to the shelf EQ. The bandpass is very easy to replicate on any EQ. If you can select the same frequency and adjust the bandwidth, you can copy pretty much any other EQ out there. The shelf, not so much. Unless you can blend with a shape control like that, it's very, very difficult to replicate the shelf of any other EQ out there. When we first came up with the prototype equalizer, that shape control was like a calibration inside. I was going to figure out like, okay, what is the undertone shelf going to be? And as soon as I got my hands on that thing, I was like, we have to put this on the front panel, you know? And then it really turned out that like, okay, wow, this is amazing. Like, this really replaces all of the other equalizers, you know, that I might have kicking around in my room. I can definitely do all of that stuff with this EQ. And that's what's amazing about it. You can create all these different shelf shapes. That's cool. Here's the other thing that's really unique about this EQ that almost no other hardware EQs out there will do, is that When you're blending into a shelf shape, any version of this, the Q control is still active. And so normally on a hardware EQ, when you switch to the shelf, the Q control doesn't do anything anymore. They just like, there's your shelf, that's what you get, enjoy it a great deal. You can't change the shape of it. On the UTEQ500, you can still adjust the Q, and it does a bunch of really wild stuff. And so you can create these really dramatic, steep shelves, and you can see it exaggerates this undershoot. And if you keep going with it, it starts to develop a boost at the frequency that you have selected and then level off. And it gets really, really extreme. Too extreme for this to show. I'm going to switch to a different piece of software to show this. Okay, so this is a bunch of captures that I did with fuzz measure that was in the original MPEQ1 manual. And this EQ it's the exact same circuit as far as its function. And so you can get an idea of what's going on here at the most extreme setting. Each one of these is progressively turning the Q up more and more and more and more. And when you get to this pink one, so here's 0 dB here, that's unity gain. And then here's 15 dB of the shelf, but then you get this extra boost at the frequency that's selected that will boost sometimes more than 30 dB. So you can get a massive amount of boost. And it comes with this really extreme undershoot that happens before the rise of this big boost. And so you get these really wild, shelf shapes. And one of the things that I really like this for is in the low end, you can do this thing where you go all the way clockwise with the shape control, and it develops that undershoot. And it's a way of moving energy in the frequency spectrum. And so a lot of times it takes two bands on an equalizer for me to like pull out some of the low mid stuff and then push up some of the more subby stuff. You can do it with one band, and then you can really exaggerate it, so it's pulling out more and creating more of a peak at the frequency that you have selected. So you can do some really cool, complicated moves even just with one band. So that gives you a good idea of how extreme this thing can go with combinations of shelf and Q settings. So if we go back to this toggle switch here, we can switch to the cut mode, and as you'd expect, it's basically just an inverse of whatever the boost is. And the cutting on the undertone EQ is done in a unique way. Most equalizers do the boosting and cutting inside the feedback loop of an amplifier that's part of that gain stage for an active parametric EQ. And there were some issues with that. We started out there, and there was a setting where it would turn, the phasing got so extreme that it turned it into a synthesizer, and then you would get like plus 28 dB of whatever frequency you had selected. So we realized we can't have that happen. So we had to come up with a different way to do the cutting. And so what we ended up doing is, remember the mixer, it splits the signal, and the version that gets filtered and is going to get blended back in, when you switch to the cut mode, it reverses the phase of that filtered signal. And so then when you blend it in, it's literally just canceling out whatever that frequency is at whatever bandwidth you have selected. It just cancels it out. And we set up the gain structure so you can adjust it so it'll do, in cut mode, it'll do 15 dB of cut at the frequency that you have selected. And it'll do it as a peak shape or a shelf shape, and the Q control stays active, and all that stuff still applies. It just takes it away instead of adds it. We realized there's another thing that you can do. If you have access to that filtered phase reversed signal that you're blending in, you can set up the gain structure so you could go past the point where it's canceling 15 dB and create what's called a notch filter, and it will completely cancel out the frequency that you have selected, and you can get these wild extreme cancellations. And that is this notch mode. So if I switch to the notch mode, you can see this thing just jumped down. It's cutting way beyond the resolution of this plug-in doctor thing. And so I'm going to switch back to another one of these screen captures of fuzz measure that I had. So this graphic gives you an idea of what's going on here. So this is the notch mode, and This is, again, with the gain set at the halfway point. That's the cancellation point where it nulls out whatever frequency that you have selected. It'll totally cancel it out. And the resolution of this fuzz measure graph, it could only show about 50 dB of cut, but it can go well beyond that. It can totally eliminate that frequency. So you can get these really, really extreme cuts. The bandwidth control is still active, and so this is just showing a variety of bandwidth settings. You can get super, super narrow, or you can have it more wide and cancel more of the surrounding frequencies. And then we realized there's another thing that you can do, and when you have access to this filtered, phase-reversed signal that's being blended in, you can keep turning it up past the point of cancellation and blend it back in with the original signal, and it will become flat again in the frequency response, except that it's been phase reversed in whatever frequency range and shape that you have selected. So if it's a band pass, then the center frequency that you have selected will be phase reversed 180 degrees, and then around that center frequency, it starts to travel back to 0 degrees phase shift in either direction. And I have a graphic that will show that. So this shows frequency selected at 1K. So at 1K, it is phase reversed 180 degrees. And then at this bandwidth setting, you can see it starts traveling back to 0 degrees phase shift in either direction on either side of it. You can get all of these varying amounts of phase shift at these different frequencies. And so, with this example, 1K is 180 degrees phase flipped, but somewhere around 500 hertz is a 90 degree phase shift. And there's some really cool things that you can do with that. I've used it at times to correct phase issues between overhead mics and a snare drum. If the distance got placed where it's not 180 degrees out one way or the other, it's, the fundamental low frequency of the snare drum is like 90 degrees out, and you flip the phase back and forth and it's two versions of the same crappy sound. With this, you could do like a 90 degree phase shift, let's say at like 200 hertz, and then all of a sudden, when you flip the phase back and forth, it's very obvious. One is really, really in and one's really, really out. You can also do a thing where if you have it in a shelf shape and you do this, you can reverse the phase of all the frequencies from a particular point and up, or a particular point and below. And when I was preparing all the stuff, the audio part of this, I stumbled onto an amazing example of an application of this. And so we're going to hear that once we get into hearing stuff. So you can hear a situation where I was trying to blend two signals together. It was basically 2 amps on a bass guitar. And when you put them together, when I flipped it one way, the low frequencies would cancel out, but all the mids and highs were more in phase. When I flipped it the other way, the low frequencies were in phase, but all the mids and highs were canceling out, and it sounded all dull and mushy. And so I was able to fix it with the UTEQ500. It was a total accident, but it just happened to work out. So we will check that out when we get into all of the audio stuff. And that's where we're going right now. Let's hear some stuff with these EQs. I recorded a little loop that we could use to demonstrate some EQ settings. And I use mostly ribbon mics because those frequently will need like a big boost in the high end, stuff like that. They require a little more wrenching with EQ. They sound beautiful once you get them there, but they're nice for a demonstration like this. So here's just so you can see what was done. Here's a quick little montage of each of the elements that was recorded. So you can see, I set up drums just in my control room. I wanted everything really dry for this, just to have things more close up and intimate, and might be easier to really hear some of the subtlety in the EQ settings and stuff. Basically, I have these 4 elements. It's pretty much one mic on each thing. There's an exception with the bass, and we'll get into that later. And so each element, got to find a cool EQ setting. Get all these things to sit together cool. I try to pick, a collection of kind of like iconic vintage equalizers for each of these things. And so for the drums, it's a Neve 1064. It's essentially the same thing as a 1073. It's just in a bigger, chassis. It's got a bigger faceplate. For the acoustic guitar, I used an API 550A. And for the Whirly, I used this old Siemens W295 equalizer. That's really incredible sounding EQ. That one's lesser known, but boy, does that thing sound great, especially for mid-rangey stuff like a Whirly. And then the bass guitar ended up doing a Pultec EQP1A, an original one of those I have kicking around here. So, that's a lot of vintage EQ firepower and a lot of very different EQ technologies. I mean, the difference between a Pultec and a 550A and a Neve, like, they are very different EQs. And the challenge was, let's get some cool settings with these amazing vintage EQs. It's probably over 20 grand worth of vintage EQs, and see if I can recreate them with the UTEQ500. So check this out. Here is the little drum part, and this is just without any EQ on it. I did put a little compression on there, just the whole thing. We kind of blend a little better. It's a little Unfair Child on there. But this is what it sounds like un-EQ'd. It sounds like what you'd expect. It's an RCA 44. It's a little flat sounding. It definitely needs to be just hyped up a little bit, a little more high end, a little more low end. So here it is. The EQ is on a hardware insert here. And you can see me turn it on and off here. So that's without it. Not much question about when it's on. But it's cool. It opened it up in a nice way, So I boosted a bunch of the shelf, which I think they refer to as a 10K shelf, but it's that weird thing where there's like an undershoot and then it comes up. And then boosted some mid-range in there, just to get the snare drum to have a little more bark to it. And then boosted a bunch of low end on there, way down at 35 hertz, just to get some cool low subby kick drum stuff on there. And so. Let's see how we did with this element. So here again is the Neve, and there's the UTEQ500. I'll show you the UTEQ500. That is right here. So that's with it on. There it is without it. There it is back on again. Sometimes it's better to just loop a very short section when you're really trying to A/B something. So you're always hearing the same part of the performance when you're comparing two things. So let's do that for a second here with these two EQs. So here's, start on the Neve. It's really close, man. Maybe I could pick that out in a blind listening test, but let's look at the curves here. So this is the Neve curve. And so you can see the big, low frequency shelf and the high frequency shelf. The Neve, when you engage the equalizer on the Neve, it has this sort of overall global roll off in the high end. And so there's a little bit of that going on. And then, I boosted right around, whatever it is here, 1.2K. In the mid-range a little bit. And so then here's the undertone EQ. And so the undertone EQ doesn't have as much of this roll off in the extended highs or the extended lows. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but I was able to get, with all three bands going, match all of these contours really, really close. There's a little bit of a difference here, but that's like a few tenths of a dB, and then once you get into the difference down here, I mean, this is 10 hertz. It's really quite different. That's 20 hertz. It's less than a dB difference down at 20 hertz. So, I mean, it's a really close match. You know, this is 10K here, so there's maybe a 2/10 of a dB difference here, and by the time you get up to 20K, there's about a, about a dB difference way up there, but probably inconsequential with, with this sound. So super duper close on that. Let's move on to the acoustic guitar. So here's the acoustic guitar with no EQ on it. So then there it is with the API 550. Without the EQ. There it is on again. And so with this, I needed to just pull out some of the resonance of that low A in this little fingerpicky riff thing. It was just kind of overwhelming, taking up too much space, not enough room for the bass guitar. Once you get that in there, I ended up cutting around 100 hertz. That was right around the fundamental frequency of that low A. And then boosting, it looks like around 600 hertz. And so the curve looks like this. So there's the cut at around 100 hertz. There's the boost around 600 hertz. And then look at the undertone match of it. I mean, you can't even distinguish the lines. They're so close. This one was really, really easy to match. There is a little bit of that difference, in the very extended low frequencies. This is all down below 20 hertz. And then there's a little bit of difference way, way up here. This is probably a couple tenths of a dB at 20K. So those are extremely close. I think it would be almost impossible to hear the difference of these, even in a blind test. But so let's hear the undertone EQ real quick. Here it is. There it is without the undertone EQ. There it is back in again. And then let's A/B these two, and we'll do a shorter loop again. Yeah, those are extremely close. I don't know that I could pick out the difference there. That is that's a good match there. Okay, so then the next we have is the Whirly. So this was that Siemens EQ. So here's the original sound. And then here it is with the EQ turned on. So it's a similar thing. I'm just kind of like pulling out some kind of, excessive low end and then adding some mid-range. And so if you look at the EQ, I'm boosting 8 dB at 1.5K and then turning down this low frequency shelf about 9 dB. I think this is down at like 50 hertz is so what I seem to remember. I don't believe it's labeled on there, but yeah, it's around 50 hertz. You can boost or cut down there. And so then did the same thing with the undertone EQ. So here's the undertone version. And I'll turn it off. Yeah, so there it is, just a little too boomy. And that nice mid-range growl in there. We can check out the curves on that. So this is these are captures that I did on these two EQs. And again, like the lines are so close that you can't even distinguish them in the really, relevant part of the spectrum. Again, in the extended part of the spectrum, that's where you start to get some variations. It looks like the Siemens EQ, the W295, had one of these sort of overall roll-offs in it. I didn't bother to replicate that part of it. This is all, like above. It's not barely even a dB, even all the way up at 20K. And then all the way down here, there's some bumpiness in the low end. It's a little smoother on the undertone, but they sort of average out to be about the same down there. But in the crucial sort of mid-range stuff, man, it was very easy to pretty much exactly replicate this curve. I mean, this is a peak EQ, so that's easy to begin with. But then the way it sort of added up with this low frequency cut was really easy to replicate. So yeah, we'll do a quick little loop of just that. There's undertone. So, you know, again, I doubt you'd be able to hear the difference in a blind A/B with between those two. It's really pretty much the same thing. So before I dive into the EQing that was done on the bass, I wanted to show quickly this thing that just sort of happened to happen in this process. It's a really great example of an application of this variable phase adjust that you can do with this UTEQ500. It's the result of this unconventional way that we do the cutting, where it's this filtered signal that's phase reversed. You can blend it back in to the point where it's unity gain again. So the frequency response of the original source is flat, but there's a portion of the frequency spectrum that has been phase reversed and varying phase degrees sort of surrounding it. So here it is. These are the two bass amps that I had for this. You know, I dusted off my old B15. I've been using a magnetone a lot for bass recently, and I love it. It sounds like this. It's got a cool, like, you know, plucky little mid-range in there, and then a nice deep subby thing, but it sounds a little hollow on the high notes. And here's the B15, and it's a little rounder for the high notes, but definitely doesn't have the subby low end. And so I want to blend the two together. So you blend them together and it's like, where did all my plucky stuff go? So you try reversing the phase on it. I'd already flipped this earlier, but you know, these were my options. Basically, you lose all the low end, but then you have all the cool mid-range. The other way, you get the low end, but you lose all the cool plucky attack. So what that means is that the way these two amps are adding up, the phasing is changing across the frequency spectrum with the signal coming from these two amps. And so what is in phase for the low frequencies ends up being out of phase for the mids and high frequencies. So you have to be able to reverse the phase of either the lows or the mids and highs in order to have everything sort of add up more. And so you can do that with the undertone EQ. So I'm going to leave this reversed this way. So it sounds kind of dull. This is right. And what I'm going to do is use the undertone EQ to reverse the phase of just the mid-range and everything above. Okay, so this is a hardware insert. I'm using this UTEQ500 right here, and the setting is notch mode. The gain control is turned all the way up because that's what puts it into this thing where this phase reversed filtered information gets turned all the way up until it's flat again to the original source signal, but everything from the frequency point and above will be phase reversed. In this case, I've selected a frequency, looks like it's about probably 400 hertz, somewhere around there. So I'll get kind of that more knocky mid-range and everything above it, and it's in a shelf shape. And so that's what makes it, you know, if I was in a peak shape, then what it would do is it would just reverse that 400 hertz and some of the stuff around it, but not everything above. So for this, I want to just know that at that sort of 400, 450 range, the phasing gets reversed, and then it just reversed all the way up above. And widest Q for this seemed to be good. Check it out. So that's without the phase adjustment. And then all that mid-range comes back because now it is in phase up there. There it is without it. We got all our mid-range back. And then I thought this was interesting, you know, because there's these these plugins now that can do this, and they do it sort of automatically. So this is Sound Radix. This is Auto Align 2, and theoretically it will do the same thing. I did the thing. I let the 2 tracks play in for 30 seconds. It did an analysis and made a correction, and you can see that it is doing a spectral phase correction here. And so, you know, it's probably somewhere in the mid-range. It's changing things around, you know. And so let's compare these. So yeah, so I have my correction going on here. So that's the auto align. And then there's doing it with the UTEQ. And it's interesting, there is something that still sounds a little bit phasey in the auto align thing. And this sounds more natural to me. I don't know, it may have just been sort of random to this particular circumstance, but when I did this, I tried the auto align thing first, just out of curiosity, and thought, well, it's basically doing what I need to, but there's something there that doesn't sound totally like just the organic sounds themselves, and so when I did it with the UTEQ, I actually did like the results better for this particular thing. I'm sure there might be circumstances where the auto align thing might be better. That thing has been really incredible on guitar. That plugin has been cool for auto aligning phasing on guitar. But for this one, I like the hardware EQ version. And just to sort of like demonstrate a little better what's going on here. So I'm going to turn this down. I've got some pink noise I can turn on. And so if I turn on the pink noise, so there it is. You can see it. It's basically flat. And so when I turn on and off this EQ, which is on here, it doesn't change the frequency response of the B15 bass amp. What's happening is that from about here up, everything starts to get phase shift. It probably starts shifting phase here, and then by around 400 hertz, by around here, it's 180 degrees phase shift. Yeah, so before we got into the EQ, I just wanted to show that and share that because it was just coincidentally a really great example of this variable phase adjust thing that you can do with the EQ. So now on to the EQing of the bass. Here we go. So we have a Pultec EQP1A on the blend of these two amps. So here's the original sound. And then here it is with the Pultec. Just tighten up the low end a little bit, a little more like high mid presence in there. It's I'm boosting 3K, and you can see what the curve looks like. Okay, and it was interesting that the setting that I ended up with just ended up looking like this sort of leveling off of the lows, you know, and then here's that 3K boost in the highs. And then here's the undertone UTEQ500 doing the same moves. So here they are, matched up super close, probably within 1/10 of a dB down here, dead on the 3K boost up there. So let's compare these two. Really, really close there. Pretty much sounds the same. So now let's hear this whole thing. I could solo everything with the vintage EQs. So this is all the vintage stuff. This is with undertone replicating everything. mean, you know, I defy anybody to take one equalizer and replicate all of those different vintage EQs and match it that close. I mean, that's almost totally indistinguishable. It would be really hard to tell those apart. And it's not easy to do. You can't just take any EQ and do all of these different shapes and all of this different stuff. It is really, really tricky to do. So, you know, I mean, it's all in there. It's all in these undertone EQs. You could do any of these moves that all of these other, you know, probably over $20,000 worth of EQs can do. And I've found that it's really sort of the character, the shapes, and the contours of how things are boosting and cutting that really are the greatest determining factor for the character of that EQ. They all have their subtle differences in coloration and stuff like that. And certainly, like, that Pultec EQ has a lot more harmonic distortion than the 500 series undertone audio EQ, but it becomes extremely minute, the difference, when you are able to replicate the shapes of those EQ moves very precisely. Those harmonic distortion differences become extremely subtle and very, very difficult to pick out. And I think that's what's hugely empowering about the undertone EQ, is that when I'm sitting down to work on something, I know it's in there. I know it's all in there, you know? And so I don't have to fish around for a different EQ in the room. I know I can get there with the undertone EQ. If I want it to sound a Pultec, it's in there. If I want it to sound like a vintage Neve, it's in there. If I want it to sound like an API, it's in there. It's all in there. And there's something about that that's hugely empowering. And it's not really necessarily about like trying to exactly replicate all of these other things. Just knowing that it can is what is significant to me. That's what really makes it so empowering to use that EQ. So there you go. That is a deep dive into the world of the undertone EQ design, the UTEQ500, now in a 500 series. Hope that was helpful, interesting, something in there for you to check out. And I will see you the next time. Bye.